I've been with my wife Deborah for 6 years, and we've been married for 11 months. We have a relatively typical past together, and I have never once seen any strange actions or warning signs. I cannot emphasize enough how completely out of character this is for her. Deborah is incredibly nice, wise, and thoughtful. She has always been a straightforward individual. She wouldn't typically act juvenile or try to intimidate me. Even horror movies are not her thing. She agreed to watch The Shining with me when we first started dating since she was aware of my penchant for horror. She was so terrified that we had to turn the movie off before she had even seen half of it. She has never been into playing practical jokes or anything scary. She just doesn't like it. And it's all right. But that was the peculiar thing about this. Just so not like her. She never experienced mental health problems, and as far as I know, it doesn't run in her family, I should probably add. Although I am aware that some people are able to conceal their mental health issues, I would have expected to have noticed an indication over our 6 years of dating. Prior to going to work 2 months ago, I was in the kitchen brewing some coffee for myself. That morning, I was running a little behind schedule and was aware that I wouldn't be able to get to Dunkin' Donuts in time for my normal morning fix. I was hurrying down the hallway toward the front door when I saw Deborah peering at me from around the corner in front of me as I took a sip of my coffee. Her eyes and a strand of her long, dark hair that was leaning against the wall were all I could make out. The remainder of her corpse was hidden by the corner. When I saw her, my coffee almost spilled. I did burn my lips to a crisp. I said, wiping a few coffee stains off my pants, "Geez, Deborah. You frightened me to death." She disappeared from view right away, acting like a small child who had been caught. By the time I arrived at the front door, she had already disappeared after I heard her scurry off towards the living room. She was acting quite strangely and completely out of character, as I already mentioned, but I also found it amusing that she was being more lighthearted and less serious. I yelled at her, declaring my love and calling her a weirdo. I could hear her giggling as I closed the door behind me. Her actions were a little strange, but they in no way warranted calling a priest. By lunchtime, I had forgotten about it, and when I arrived home, she had returned to normal. Life continued without it being discussed by either she or I. 3 days later, the subsequent occurrence took place. I got out of bed around 2 in the morning to fetch a drink. I had a jug of OJ in my hand and was seated at the kitchen island when I suddenly had the distinct impression that I was being observed. For some reason, my wife's smiling face was staring back at me from the floor. Her huge, unblinking eyes were beaming down at me from across the island, and she was smiled broadly. The Cheshire Cat's grin is on full display. "I'll admit it," I yelled. "Fear, not frustration, is the driving force." I felt frightened for no apparent cause at the time. She scrambled out of the kitchen on all fours when she heard my scream. Her hands and feet were pounding the tile floor in her haste. Even though she ran away, I didn't chase her or yell after her. I was dumbfounded and couldn't believe she'd done such a thing. To be honest, returning to the top floor took me a little longer than I'd have liked to admit. When I got to our bedroom, Deborah was lying on her side, asleep. Making an attempt, at the very least. In order to verify that she was in fact asleep, I stood there for a bit, keeping an eye on her breathing. Upon entering the bedroom, I had the distinct impression she would leap out at me. However, she did not. Even after I had climbed into bed with her, she didn't move an inch. I was beginning to question whether or not this was all a dream. The next morning I waited for her to come down for coffee, and after offering her a mug and caressing her cheek, I decided to ask her about it. "What was that about last night?" I inquired, keeping my tone light so as not to insult or humiliate her. When I explained what I was talking about, her face fell and she shook her head like she didn't know what I was talking about. As I pointed to the floor near the kitchen island, "You were spying at me again, from over there," I remarked. It was only when she looked back at me that she started to chuckle. I couldn't help but join her in her hysterics. "He creeps the fuck out of me sometimes," I said. With her cup on the counter and her arms wrapped around my neck, she giggled and sat down. "So, I think we're even," the woman jokingly said. We said our goodbyes and departed for work. I kept thinking about how unsettling it was to see her beaming at me from behind the island. While crawling away, I could hear the sounds her hands were making on the floor. I consoled myself with the thought that she was being facetious, just trying to join me in my love of all things horror. Honestly, I didn't have a problem with her. But it still didn't sit right with me. I became increasingly aware of her sly glances in my direction. She would occasionally peek out from behind the couch or the drapes in the living room. Occasionally, she'll sneak into the old trunk next to our bed, which belonged to her grandma. My only clue that she was there was because of the trunk's old hinges. She'd propped the lid up just enough so that only half of her face was visible. She'd been beaming like a gleeful child as she waited for the results. It was a little unsettling at first. I was speechless when I saw her. All I could muster was a stoic expression. Finally, when I was able to speak up, I asked her why she was doing this to me. She didn't respond, but the trunk's lid had been slowly closed, trapping her within. Walking away from the situation made me feel uneasy. I had no idea what she was up to, but it was obvious that she was having a good time. The only thing I prayed for was that she would grow tired of the game soon. During the following 2 weeks, Deborah didn't even glance my way once. I felt glad when I realized she had finished her bizarre hoax. We were watching Netflix one night and I jokingly stated that I hadn't noticed her peering at me lately and that she must have given up on her spy game. She raised an eyebrow at me and remarked, "Maybe I've just grown better at it," with a tiny smile. I kept my mouth shut, but I couldn't help but wonder whether she was serious. Her words lingered in my mind for the next few days. When I wasn't looking, was she still peeping her head around the corner and I hadn't noticed? If this is the case, why did she do this? I began to worry about her lurking around the corner or hiding behind a door, and I became increasingly nervous. When she wasn't in my direct line of sight, I got the creeps. I was dumbfounded and even a bit deranged. However, after a few weeks with no further incidents, I was able to unwind a little bit more. In the end, I decided it was just a bad memory and stopped looking behind the furniture and the walls. Everything went from bad to worse just a few days ago. It was a quiet afternoon, so I sat on the couch and played a few games on my laptop while Deborah went out. As soon as I got out of the shower, I received a creepy sensation in my stomach that I was being watched. I opened my eyes and nearly died when I realized what was happening. In the shower, Deborah's entire head was submerged, allowing only her torso to be seen from the outside. The ends of her long, dark hair dripped water as they dangled on the curtain. As if she hadn't blinked in a while, her mouth hung open in a savage grin, her eyes wide and red. Jumping backward, I shouted and screamed. She remained still and her smile remained unwavering. 2 black streaks of makeup slid down her cheeks as she sat at her desk. I couldn't help but notice how delirious and insane she appeared. I was afraid to death. We both remained there silently for a few moments. Eventually, after what seemed like an eternity, she gently emerged from the shower, and I watched her through the shower curtain as she made her way toward the bathroom door. The bathroom door banged shut with such force that the mirror was shaken. To secure the bathroom, I leapt from the shower and yelled one more time. I spent nearly an hour in the restroom. I'm sorry if I was too harsh with some of you. Regardless of whether it was a joke or not, I had had enough of the wacky things. In the middle of the night, I continued repeating that to myself as I paced the bathroom and checked the door every few minutes. I pressed my ear to the bathroom door and strained to hear a muffled sound. As a result of my acoustic impalement, I was unable to hear Deborah's laughter on the other side of the door. A wave of rage washed through me. I was enraged that I had to hide in the bathroom for an hour because I was made to feel afraid in my own home. What's the point? Is this a joke? If it was a prank, it was a terrible prank. What the fuck was she thinking, Deborah? I awaited an apology or for her to label me a jerk. This thing is becoming really fucking tiresome. Although it was so subtle that I had to question if I had heard it at all, the sound was followed by silence. Deborah? I yelled, my voice shaking uncontrollably. Nothing came back to me. Just the sound of my own sighing. As I screamed, I swear to God, Just stop it. I pounded on the door, my fist clenched against it. Because of my conversational style, I expected her to lash out at me. It was the first time I had ever screamed at her. However, nothing was found. A small trickle from the shower head is all that is heard. There is no denying that I felt nervous. To open the door and face my own wife, I was too scared to do so. At this point, I had to wait another 30 minutes or so, which felt like an eternity to me. The time had come for me to look behind the door of my bathroom, as I had made the decision that I would not be spending the night there. Thankfully, I didn't see her face staring back at me as I waited for her to arrive. Deborah was nowhere to be found in the hallway leading to the top of the stairs. I wasn't sure if that was something to be excited about or not. There was no sign of her, so I kept my eyes peeled for a few minutes. Mentally preparing myself to open the door, I sat up, my hand hovering above it. I was ready to yank open the door with shaking hands when I heard a sound that still makes me nauseated to this day. This time the moan was more insistent, but I knew exactly where it was coming from. My wife was peering out from the small crack in the closet door as I slowly tilted my head toward it. It was the most horrific gaping smile I'd ever seen, and her eyes were still wide open. In fact, I didn't even scream when I saw what was happening. Even then, I was terrified. With her arms around her chest, she appeared to be quivering with joy as if she couldn't contain her pleasure. Shivers ran up and down my spine as she let out a short hoarse groan from deep within her throat. I managed to unlock the bathroom door somehow and dashed down the steps as fast as I could, grabbing my keys and phone off the coffee table in the living room, before sprinting to the curb to get to my car. However, I could still hear her hysterical laughing coming from behind me, but I could not see her. There was no need for me to close the door to my house. As I left the house, I shivered uncontrollably, either because of the cold or because of my terror. It could be a bit of both. A coat and shoes weren't on my list of things to bring. My boxers were still on and my hair was moist. I ignored all calls and texts while driving to my brother Wesley's house, which is around 40 minutes away. I didn't check my phone until I had arrived at my brother's house and was parked securely in his driveway. As Deborah had called and texted me 4 times, she was curious as to where I was and why I had left like that. In a fit of wrath, I threw my phone on the dashboard, miffed by her carefree demeanor. In spite of the fact that I was wearing nothing but a pair of boxers, my brother and his wife were more than happy to have me around. Wesley offered to lend me some clothes and inquired as to what had transpired. We had an argument, but I didn't get into specifics. A crazy prank wasn't enough to have me leave my wife for him, so I didn't want him to believe I was overreacting. I mean, haven't I been trying to get her to lighten up for a long time? This was not at all what I had envisioned when I asked her to loosen up. My mind wouldn't let me sleep on their couch, despite my best efforts. I could see Deborah's face in the closet whenever I closed my eyes. My skin crawled when I realized she'd been in there the entire time. She hadn't even left the restroom. After sneaking inside the closet and slamming her way through, she snuck out of the restroom and fooled me. Going back to my childhood home made me nervous just thinking about it. I was unable to sleep while I writhed in my bed. Because I was so exhausted, Wesley gave me a sleeping medication so that I could catch some shut-eye. During the night, I had a lot of scary dreams. There is nothing like Deborah's gleeful face. I woke up as the sun was about to rise. I was exhausted and my weary body ached as I sat on the sofa. In the end, I had no idea what to tell Deborah when I had to call her. Even if she promised she'd never do anything creepy again, I wouldn't be going home until she did. I only craved the return of my wife. To be honest, I've never seen her as serious as she is now. When I got that familiar feeling, I was about to call her and tell her that. As though someone was keeping an eye on me at all times. My heart was in my throat as I sat there, staring at the ceiling. For as long as I ignored it, my discomfort grew worse. My gaze naturally shifted away from the ceiling. This time, her face was plastered against the window, peering down at me with the same wide smile. Drool dripped from her lips and streaked the glass in 2 directions. Something told me she'd been there for a long time, probably all night. I didn't know how long she'd been there. However, Even though I was scared that my wrath would outweigh any terror I felt at the time, I decided not to shout. I jumped from the couch and slammed my palm into the window, causing the glass to shatter. In response, I yelled, "Deborah! What's wrong with you? Just go home. Now." Ghastly expressions never faded from her face, and she didn't appear to be moving. The more she laughed, the more her smile grew, like if she'd never been happier. In the upper room, Wesley and his wife could be heard moving about. Deborah's head moved slightly as if she could hear them from outside, and she began to gently close her mouth. Wesley was clearly anxious as he called my name from above. I saw him and his wife, Rebecca, coming down the staircase. Deborah was gone when I returned to the window. Drool was still pouring down the glass, the sole evidence that she had been there at all. I tried to explain to Wesley and Rebecca what had happened when I awoke to see Deborah standing outside their window, observing me. They had their doubts, but who wouldn't? When Wesley and I stepped outside to check the area in front of the window, we found only a small indentation in the dirt. Wesley opined that it was probably an animal, and I didn't object. In his and Rebecca's minds, the entire experience must have been a dream, but they didn't get it, and I was too exhausted to try to explain. On that particular day, I made a phone call to cancel my shift and turned off my mobile phone. I dreaded the prospect of having to deal with Deborah. At that point, I couldn't even talk to her. After a while, I began to suspect that something was seriously wrong with her. No matter what she promised, we would never be the same people she found us to be. My heart ached at the mere notion of it. I was inconsolable for most of the day. I was ready to confront her by the time it got to midday. A final chance to explain herself should be given to her. After 6 years, I reminded myself, I could at least give her that. She'd sent dozens of SMS to my phone, all coming from a wife who appeared to be worried. "Is it okay if we have a conversation? I'm in love with you. I'd appreciate it if you could get in touch with me. I'm concerned. Are you able to respond? Come back. And there will be more of the same in the future." All of the texts she sent were messages expressing her love for me and her want for me to return home with her. None of them addressed the craziness of what she did, which made her uneasy. The way she acted was if she hadn't come from a Stephen King novel. Her texts, too, were unique. In the past, she'd text books simply to tell me to go get bread. Surely she would have something to tell me after all of her crazy antics. To those of you who are far removed from the situation, it may appear silly. However, if you had seen Deborah's reaction when she scurried away on all fours, grinning at me from the closet like a madman, you'd agree that my reaction was appropriate. I ended up spending another night with Wesley and Rebecca. As luck would have it, I didn't wake up until afternoon yesterday, and thankfully Deborah wasn't observing me through the window. I don't want to pry, because it's not my place. But is this fight something that can be mended? Rebecca inquired. For lunch, she had prepared a sandwich for both of us, and I knew she wanted to bring up the subject without appearing to be intrusive. It's like she's a completely different person, and I'm stumped as to why. I don't know, I responded, selecting my words carefully. She and Wesley still hadn't gotten a full picture of the batshit lunacy I was dealing with. There is no doubt in my mind that Ben has changed over time, but he is still the same woman you married. Perhaps you and Ben just need to talk about your problems. Whatever is going on, I am confident it can be fixed. My response was, I don't believe that talking would help. I simply don't trust her. The words cut me to the core. I longed for and adored my wife, who had left me. It's impossible for me to put up with somebody like them. It didn't sound desirable to live in continual fear. She remarked, Deborah loves you. She needs to be devastated, she said. My response was, I'm not sure about that. In Rebecca's opinion, Deborah was clearly distraught. Well, she certainly seemed like it to me. I've never seen her that distressed. Very much unlike the Deborah I know, she remarked, shrugging. Her words took some time to sink in, but as soon as they did, dread began to creep up my spine. My mouth became dry as I questioned, wait. What do you mean, you saw her? You saw Deborah? Nodding her head in agreement, Rebecca seemed unfazed by the news. Maybe it wasn't for her. She came by this morning, after Wesley left for work, she added, as she wiped the table. Maybe she used an Uber or something? I didn't see her automobile. What had she said? Had she come in? I inquired, my forehead beginning to perspire. I started scanning the area around me as though a predator was lurking in the shadows. I asked if she wanted me to wake you and she said no, just to let you sleep. She responded as she scrubbed the dishes, no. She had just asked whether I was awake and I replied that I wasn't. Asked whether she had any more to add, that's all she said? There was nothing wrong with her appearance, but she looked like she hadn't slept in days. I got up from the table and thanked Rebecca for the lunch she had prepared for us. In a small way, I felt relieved that she hadn't entered the house. Still, I needed to double-check that the doors were shut and secure before I left. It took me a bit to come up with a plan of action. Because Deborah had entrusted me with her well-being, I felt that I had a duty to help her if I could. Isn't it my vow to her that I would love and honor her no matter what? She was clearly in a bad way. For as long as she was ill, which I really believed she was, I couldn't just walk away. However, I was at a loss as to where to begin. To make matters worse, I had no idea what to say to the authorities if I did. That my wife was snooping around on me? Is it possible that she was being a little too overt? Even though she'd been as outlandish as she'd been, she hadn't broken any laws. Not just yet, at least. Most likely, the cops would have deemed my response to be excessive. It wasn't a hoax or a prank, however. It was jarring. Dangerous, if not lethal. Her smile was menacing, as if something was lurking beneath it. However, what if she behaved normally in their presence despite the fact that I was well within my rights as her husband to have her institutionalized? That she'd fooled Rebecca into thinking she was merely a worried wife is a testament to her skill. Doctors would be forced to release her after 72 hours if they didn't find her a threat to herself or others. Anxiousness gripped me. What a husband would do is what I did. I dialed her mother's number and spoke to her. The truth is, I didn't want to. The relationship I had with Marianne's mother was strained at best. Before this, neither of us had ever had a physical altercation. She lacked warmth and friendliness, and it was difficult to work with her. Even when she did appear to grin, it was just a thin-lipped one, and her eyes remained as vacant. The impression she gave off was that she was always trying to get the upper hand. The few times I'd seen her were brief ones, and I'd only met her once before. I had the distinct impression she disapproved of my adoption as her child. Deborah was always quick to get us out of the house because she didn't want me to feel uncomfortable. It was nearly terrible to be around her mother. Like walking on a thin layer of glass. We didn't have to visit her as often after we relocated 3 states away. I was pleased to avoid the woman, but I needed her help. To be honest, I really didn't want to talk to her, but I had no choice because I needed someone who was more knowledgeable about Deborah than myself. So I gritted my teeth and went through with it. Already sounding annoyed, she replied, yes. When I called Marianne, I said, Marianne, it's me, Ben. Do you have a minute to speak? Her clucking of her tongue could be heard. In the middle of a check writing session, but if you insist, I'd be happy to talk to you, Benjamin. What is it that you'd like to talk about? Deborah has been acting strangely, and I was wondering if you had any insight into what might be going on. I was cut off in mid-sentence. It's about Deborah. What do you want from me, Benjamin? I'm having a hard time keeping up with your ramblings. In her thin sweater and pants, she was tapping her nails on the table as if waiting for something to happen. The question I had for you was, have you ever seen anything weird behavior-wise? Or potentially any mental health issues? I said. A long, awkward pause ensued that I couldn't tell if she was just pondering or anything more. A few seconds later, she finally said. When she continued, I don't know whether this is one of your jokes, Benjamin, but if it is, I don't find the humor in it. I cut her off before she could get rid of me. My annoyance was clear in my voice as I replied, Marianne, it's not a joke. I'm truly concerned about Deborah's mental health. Her conduct has been very erratic lately. I'm very worried about her, and I expected as her mother you would be as well. I don't know what you expect of me, she snapped, but if you're really worried, I suggest you consult with a doctor. I knew she was on the verge of hanging up, but for some reason I was determined to keep the conversation going. When I first met her, I had the impression that she knew more than she was revealing. Do it for Deborah, if not for me. I tried. As she struggled to maintain her stony demeanor, I caught a trembling intake of breath. Marianne? What's wrong? I began. There is nothing I can tell Benjamin. My only recommendation is that he seek professional help and not contact here again. Goodbye. I tried to reach out to her, but she had hung up the phone. It took me some time to process the phone conversation and her refusal to assist me in any way. Because, even if she didn't like me, why wouldn't she want to assist her own daughter out? That was beyond my comprehension. In an attempt to catch a stray nugget of information, I listened to the entire dialogue again. Then I remembered her last words to me: seek professional treatment, she'd advised with a sense of urgency. I could have been imagining things, but I was certain her tone had shifted just a tad as she said it. Like they were extremely significant. What did she mean? It's possible she was referring to someone other than medical experts. Someone who, for whatever reason, she didn't feel confident enough to address directly. Alternatively, I may have been in a state of desperation. After a long and exhausting conversation with Wesley and Rebecca, I was able to persuade them that Deborah needed professional help with her mental health. They didn't get the full story. But even though I wasn't ready to go into it yet, I informed them about our last encounter. How she'd sneaked into the bathroom and peeked out of the closet to see what I was doing. It was evident that they were taken aback, but happily they trusted me. They, too, were only trying to do their best for her. It wasn't all that serious to them. Maybe a little strange, but not in any way hazardous. There was no doubt in anyone's mind that Deborah was pulling some sort of prank on them. A half-hearted, maybe for YouTube, was Rebecca's best guess. Wesley was of the opinion that we shouldn't call the cops just yet. Instead, he volunteered to accompany me, an offer I gladly accepted. He reasoned that the best line of action was to speak quietly to her and attempt to persuade her to go along with him. I acquiesced to his method. At least I wouldn't be alone when I entered that home. After breakfast this morning, we set off on our journey. I had no intention of traveling late at night. My tummy did somersaults as soon as we parked into the garage. Despite the fact that her car wasn't there, I wasn't going to let my guard down. In that single second, I believed I could see her eyes peering through the crack in the front door. I was trembling and perspiring. Wesley, on the other hand, appeared to be in good health. I opened the door and he waited for me with his hands in his pockets, as though he were going for a stroll across the park. In some ways, I wished I could be like him and be ignorant. As soon as I opened the door, I was assaulted with the smell of decay. Wesley walked into the home after me with his nose twisted up because he could smell it, too. Wesley muttered, "What the hell do you guys use to clean the floors here, shit?" "Shut up," I murmured, my gaze darting about in search of Deborah's apparition. Despite the fact that it was just 10 a.m., the house was eerily silent and eerie. All of the drapes were drawn tightly, preventing the entry of any natural light. I'd have assumed the house was deserted if I hadn't just left it 2 days before. We walked from room to room, inspecting every crevice for signs of her presence and occasionally crying out her name. Wesley eventually inquired as to why the fuck are you searching beneath the couch? Aren't we looking for your wife? He looked at me as if I were a complete nutter. I muttered, "Let's just go upstairs." I went up the stairs to investigate the bathroom and spare bedroom, and he just shook his head and followed. Glass fragments scattered a few of the steps as I made my way up the staircase. Deborah and I had a wedding portrait hung along the staircase, but it appeared to have been damaged. All of the glass had been taken from the frame, so it hung wonky. A knot formed in my throat as I glanced at the image. We snapped this picture right after saying our vows and walking out of the church. Her white gown made her appear really stunning. Deborah's gorgeous beauty caught my eye. I never expected her appearance to be so frightening. When we got to the top, we glanced in the spare room, but it was empty. My apprehension from the previous night returned as I hesitated to enter the restroom. When Wesley saw what was going on, he offered to go in alone, but I couldn't allow him to do so. Then we walked in jointly, inspecting the closet and the bathroom. Nothing had been done to the bathroom since the night before I left. In the absence of an answer, Wesley suggested packing a bag and returning the next day to see if she was still there. I sighed and walked to our bedroom to pack a duffel bag with some clothes. It wasn't until I went to inspect our closet that I realized what was causing the stench. Wesley's cheeks became pale at the sight of it. To get away from the sight and stench, he had to stand near the steps. I couldn't believe what I saw as I peered into my bedroom closet. There were at least a dozen pairs of eyeballs soaking in the rug, all meticulously arranged. Smaller than a marble, some were the size of a quarter. When I looked at the eyes she had collected from little creatures, I shuddered at the thought of how she obtained them. It's bad enough that Becca has a shoe obsession, but this is ridiculous. Wesley muttered, gagging. In the hallway Ben yelled out, "Ben, I think we should go." "I'm starting to feel sick," she said. "Okay." I grabbed my duffel and locked the closet door on my new horror. "All right," I said. I took a big breath as I stepped into the hallway. I couldn't stop gagging because I could taste the rot on my tongue. Wesley muttered, "Who the fuck does that in their closet?" Then I added, "I tried to tell you she needed help." "A demon exorcist is what she needs right now, Ben." "She doesn't need help, Ben," he added. That fragrance is so unbearable that his words froze in his mouth, and his eyes widened in panic. "Are you coming or not?" I did not inquire as to why. It was there. I wasn't sure if it was the eyes in the closet that were keeping an eye on me, but it wasn't them. I swiveled around, surveying the room with my gaze. As I suddenly realized what we'd been missing, I whispered, "Wesley," to myself. There, curled up on her side, watching us like a kid on Wesley's morning, my wife was waiting for us under the bed. She clung to her chin with her hands, which were trembling with excitement. I could hear her soft moans now that she was aware she had been found. It was as if she was hiccuping, as if the thrill was too much for her to handle. To put it mildly, it was unnerving. Wide-eyed and beaming, with the same enormous grin. I ignored my instinct to flee, despite the overwhelming want to do so. That's my wife, here. Regardless of how twisted she became, she was still the woman I married. I felt compelled to assist her. "Deborah," I whispered to myself. Even though she didn't say anything, her head bobbed quickly back and forth as if she were nodding. When I asked, "Baby, I just want to help, okay? Can you let me do that?" He said, "Yes." One stride forward and I was charging for her like some kind of predator. "Deborah, I love you," I whispered as I stepped closer. I had to fight the impulse to flee when she let out a small sigh from her wide-open mouth. Her shoulders began to tremble, and her eyes grew as wide as saucers as she awaited the answer. As soon as I lowered my height to have a better look at her, I noticed that she was bloodied. It was all over her hands. The closer I approached, the more trembling they became, as if she was struggling to keep her emotions in check. "Are you harmed, Deborah?" I inquired, noticing the profuse bleeding. It seemed as if she was playing an unseen piano with her bloodied fingers, bobbing her head and bobbing her head back and forth. There were times when she was hit on the cheek, which resulted in small blood spots being left on her skin. I was disgusted and wanted to squirm back in my seat. I was disgusted by the stench she was emitting. It seemed as if the vomit was attempting to climb up my esophagus. There was blood coming out of the creases on her lips. To avoid leaving her in such a vulnerable situation, I had to force her to emerge from her cocoon. I drew closer to her and tried to touch her. The hiccuping noises grew louder and her hands shook, stretching her fingers, as she became more agitated. When I looked between her fingers, I saw the blood flowing out. We had to get Deborah to the hospital since she was in such bad shape from the hemorrhage. She sprang out of her seat and grabbed my hand before I could even get there. I sank to my knees in agony as a piercing ache ripped through my arm. Anguish was radiating from my arm, and I could see blood trickling from it onto the floor. My jaw dropped when I saw her grinning maniacally and grasping a large shard of glass in her hands. Wesley came up behind me and asked, "You all right in there?" Nodding, I put my arm around his shoulder and cradled him. When I returned my gaze to Deborah, I noticed that she had switched her attention elsewhere. She had shifted her attention away from me. She had also lost her smile. Despite the fact that I couldn't see her, she was staring past me, her gaze fixed on Wesley like that of a ravenous lion upon an impala. She had a snarl instead of a smile on her face as her jaw hung open. It took me a while to get up and walk backwards down the hall because I was frightened to look away from her. Wesley inquired, "Are you bleeding?" Deborah scurried out from under the bed with the glass shard still in her fist as soon as he said those words. "Wesley! Run! Go!" I shouted at him. A split second later, I felt my back bump into his, which led me to believe he was terrified to move. Even though he'd come down the steps, he'd remained at the top, staring in fear at my wife. Angry Deborah had gotten out of the bed and stood in the doorway of the bedroom, her face contorted in contempt. Her entire body tensed up. Her fingers bled, and the blood splattered the floor. "Jesus, Deborah," Wesley began, "you playing hide and seek?" I pushed him toward the stairwell. "Move your ass, Wesley," I replied as softly as I possibly could. Laughing, Deborah bobbed her head in jerky jerks and stretched her mouth wide, making her chin appear to touch her chest as she smiled. Wesley had just finished saying a quick prayer when I heard him sprint down the stairs. I was at the top of the steps, torn between my need to help this woman and my own survival. "I just want to assist," I murmured, holding back my tears. As she slowly lifted the glass in front of her, her gaze returned to me. As soon as I saw her, she sprinted toward me, her face beaming with joy. Fortunately, my body took control and I sped down the steps, skipping 2 or 3 at a time, till I reached the bottom. To my horror, as soon as I opened the front door, she jumped onto my back and wrapped her arms around my neck, hiccuping so loudly in my ear that I could hear it. We both fell to the floor as a result of her shaking off of me. My back hurt so badly as she walked away, but I tore open the front door and sprinted to my car. Wesley was chatting on the phone with the cops while standing in the front yard. I hurried to my car and jumped in without saying anything. Wesley finally got the message and came after me, all the while still talking to 911. I kept an eye on the rearview mirror, expecting to see her chasing after us in the rearview mirror. However, this was never the case for me. 11 stitches were put in my arm, while 3 were put in my back. The police questioned a lot and returned to Deborah's residence to look, but she was nowhere to be found. They urged me to seek temporary housing with a family member or friend and to seek a restraining order as soon as possible, but none of that helped. I had a gut feeling that something was going to happen. I drove an hour to a motel after dropping Wesley off at his house. I wanted to keep Deborah as far away from me as possible. In this exact spot for the past 4 hours. I had hoped the cops would come across her and be able to offer her the assistance she so sorely requires. I was wrong. Now, however, I'm not so sure. Because I received an SMS from an unknown number just 40 minutes ago. 3 simple words. "I found you," I said. "Thank you." There's also an image attached. I recognized it right away, despite the photo's poor quality and graininess. My wife's gaze was unmistakable. I started writing this post right away. There is nothing I can do. I'm terrified and alone, and I can't help but think I'm being watched.